Okay, so the majority of floriculture growers in Ontario have been using biocontrol as their primary means of thrips control for many years now. For the most part, the standard IPM strategy of predatory mites and Botanigard sprays have been very effective, but some growers have started to notice in the last 5 to 10 years that their IPM programs that used to work well for thrips just wasn't able to keep up anymore. In a recent survey that we conducted at the Vineland Research and Innovation Center, 57% of growers said that they noticed more frequent or severe thrips outbreaks in the last 5 years. So what changed? To figure this out, Sarah decided to have a closer look at the thrips themselves. Starting in 2016, OMAFRA began collecting and identifying thrips from floriculture greenhouses to verify exactly which species we had. And then I continued these surveys in 2019 as a part of my master's project. What we found is that although Western flower thrips still made up the majority of the thrips samples, on average, onion thrips made up about 30%. And this was a lot more than anyone expected because until this point, everyone just assumed that any yellow colored thrips in the greenhouse was Western flower thrips. Now, these relative proportions, so like this is an average, but they varied really dramatically depending on the location, which crop, and the different years. And in some sort of circumstances, onion thrips can be the dominant species. And we don't actually know the reasons what makes onion thrips a major problem in some greenhouses or not. Although Western flower thrips and onion thrips look very much alike and share many of the same host plants, they do have a few key differences, particularly when it comes to their management. Biocontrol has been working pretty well for Western flower thrips most of the time, and that's good news because they are still as pesticide resistant as ever. Biocontrol hasn't been working as well, however, for onion thrips. They do appear to be more susceptible to pesticides compared to Western flower thrips, but they do also have a history of pesticide resistance, so there's no telling how long this is going to last. Greenhouses with high proportions of onion thrips also often experience more severe damage, but we don't actually know if all of the recent increases in the thrips outbreaks that growers have been experiencing are attributable to onion thrips or not, but I'm sure that is a contributing factor. So where did onion thrips come from all of a sudden? The truth is that onion thrips aren't that new at all. They've actually been established in Canada for well over 100 years. They used to be important greenhouse pests before the widespread use of pesticides in greenhouses. Since then, they've still, stuck around as a pest, primarily in outdoor crops, unsurprisingly in onions. And then Western flower thrips didn't actually start to take over the world and come to Canada until like the 80s and 90s. Thanks to their exceptional level of pesticide resistance, they became a major driving force behind the adoption of biocontrol in Canada. So I like to think that they helped in a very small way. In the early 2000s, though, changes in the pest management practices of onion crops led to increases in onion thrips pressure outdoors. By the 2010s, the majority of greenhouse growers were using biocontrol, especially for thrips. This increase in biocontrol use also came with a corresponding decrease in pesticide use. And it's my theory that the combination of increasing onion thrips outside, as well as a decrease in pesticide use inside, is what has led to their big comeback. But this is just my theory, and we don't actually know precisely when thrips populations in the greenhouse started to change, and that is for one very important reason. The reason being that no one was looking. The last time that greenhouses in Ontario were surveyed for their thrips species was in the 1980s, which means that there's a 30-year gap on our knowledge between the last survey and ours, so we don't really know what happened in that interval. One of the reasons why no one was looking is because with the naked eye, or even with a hand lens, all yellow colored thrips pretty much look the same. Even a thrips expert can't confidently tell yellow thrips apart without a microscope. And it's because of this barrier that until very recently, most growers and consultants just assumed that yellow colored thrips in the greenhouse were Western flower thrips. To identify thrips, you need to have a microscope and a taxonomic key. And this is another major barrier to identification. Most taxonomic keys are very complicated to use. They cover dozens or hundreds of species. The wording is really difficult to understand, even for me, and they use features that can only be seen under a very expensive compound microscope. But luckily, what we found is that the species that we typically find in greenhouses, we can tell them apart pretty reliably using a few simple features. So Sarah and I developed a key to species found in Ontario greenhouses. We designed it specifically for growers and consultants, and it uses features that you can see using a dissection microscope like the one in this picture. The most important features that we use in our key are the ocelli, which are these spots between the compound eyes, and the pronotum, which is the body segment below the head. Under a microscope, the differences between onion thrips and western flower thrips are actually pretty simple. Western flower thrips have red ocelli and long hairs on both the top and the bottom of the pronotum. Basically, they're a hairy beast. If it's not a hairy beast, it's probably not a western flower thrips. Onion thrips, on the other hand, have gray ocelli, and they're pretty much, most of the time, you just don't really see anything. And they only have hairs on the bottom of the pronotum, and those hairs are much daintier compared to the western flower thrips. So like once you've seen this comparison side by side, it does get a lot simpler. And if you want to start identifying your own thrips, you can find our key on the On Floriculture blog. In addition to western flower thrips and onion thrips, we also found chrysanthemum thrips, tobacco thrips, echinothrips. We found these pretty regularly in ornamental greenhouses throughout the region, although these species, they usually show up in really low numbers, but I have seen each of them cause outbreaks, so it's worth being aware of their existence, particularly if you're seeing some unusual thrips activity. So for example, chrysanthemum thrips really hammers the bottom leaves of a plant. So it's really distinctly different from what you'd see with western flower thrips. You can read more about the new thrips on the block in the February 2020 edition of Greenhouse Canada magazine. We've also found a few less common species, some of which are invasive. Most notably, Thrips parvispinus has recently popped up in a few greenhouses in the Niagara region and Essex County. By being aware of other Thrips species and having them identified, you're more likely to be able to spot these unusual Thrips like this yourself. And this allows you to intervene early and prevent them from establishing in the greenhouse. You can read more about the Thrips parvispinus in the September 2022 edition of Greenhouse Canada, and Sarah is also going to be giving a talk about them at this year's CGC. Besides intercepting possible invasive pests, why should you have your thrips identified? When we start to assume that western flower thrips was the only thrip species, we forgot the first tenet of IPM, which is to start by identifying your pest. And as we've seen before with greenhouse versus Bemisia whitefly, or green peach versus foxglove aphid, you can't always use the same IPM program for all species of a given pest. And this seems to be the case for thrips as well. Misidentifying your pest means that you could be releasing bios that aren't having any effect, which is the equivalent of throwing your money away. So if your Thrips IPM program isn't working as well as it used to, or you're seeing some unusual damage patterns, take a step back and make sure that you're dealing with the pest that you think you are. Now, growers don't necessarily need to ID the thrips themselves. A number of consultants have started to use our key to ID thrips for their clients, or you can send samples to Amafra and then we can help you out.